Hey, we're live.
Yeah.
So, hey guys, I'm Sam Flegal. I'm an artist who does art based around Norse mythology, or as we had a conversation on Facebook around Norse lore is the term that I really prefer. But Google likes to search Norse mythology, so sometimes you got to do what the SEO likes. So, hey,
that's right.
There you go. If you guys are catching this live, man, thank you so much for being here. I think that's super cool. And if you're watching it later, I mean, you're cool too. I'm just happy you're watching this thing. So I'm here with Kenny. Kenny, tell us about yourself.
What's up, guys? I'm Kenny. I was a tattooer before quarantine.
Yeah.
Now I'm just kind of designing games and doing that kind of thing, making art still, doing a lot of commission paintings, which is a lot of fun.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's good.
What about you?
I these days, other than playing Skyrim more, my life's pretty much the same. Like I still make art. I just don't go to conventions, that's it. But anyway, we're not here to talk so much about that side of things. We're just going to talk about Norse mythology, and you've got some heathen leanings and a curiosity for this topic. And we've done a couple episodes. So you know what? Why don't you kick it off? What you got on your brain right now, Kenny?
So this is my biggest one. Biggest question is, well, maybe not the biggest question, but one of the questions that's burning in me lately is we know the Nordic pantheon, the Germanic pantheon.
Okay.
So I guess I'm going to distinguish between the two tonight. Okay, so between Norse, so like Odin and Othin and Thor, and between Woden and Dunar, right?
Okay.
So, but why is it? I think it's interesting that Odin is the All-Father, but like you're wearing, Thor's hammer, like Mjolnir, and those were we don't really have a symbol that's like for Othin, right?
So there is thought that there is one symbol for Odin, and that's the Valknut, which is 3 interlocking triangles, and it appears all throughout carvings throughout Scandinavia and other Old Norse cultures. But you're right in that the Valknut was not worn openly. At least there's no historical record to show it. It was carved on grave sites as a part of the burial rituals in some way, we think, as well as appearing on some of the runic stones. So its use was clearly very different. So
right.
Why Thor's hammer? Well, Thor was the common man's god. So Odin has somewhere around 150 names. He has more names than any other god, but some of those names are like the lying one and the cheater and the god of hanged men and the battleborn. And so the general thought was that it was kind of considered bad luck to have Odin's favor anywhere except for battle. And even in battle, it was considered dangerous because in that particular way, like Odin's favor could turn at any moment, and you could meet death. And Odin was death. And every Odinic tale can more or less be boiled down to you gain the favor of Odin, you do some like super badass shit, either magically or usually in battle. You like get some sort of unstoppable sword or, runic magic to get you out of a situation. But at some point in the story, your luck turns and you die in battle, because how does Odin get his crew for Ragnarok? He gets them, you got to go to Valhalla, and to go to Valhalla, you got to die in battle. And so ultimately Odin's favor had a lot of superstition and fear around it, whereas Thor was considered to be, a god of the people. He's in some part an agricultural god, watering the crops and helping the things grow. He's a family man, even though, Odin is called the All-Father, but Thor has many more traits of someone who's like actually interacting well with his wife and kids and, that kind of stuff. And so I really just think it comes down to like Thor is was, and I think is a role model for many people. And Odin was considered dangerous. Now, that's not to say that there were not people who followed Odin, but often in the lore, there's like three types of people that follow Odin. They're poets who are summoning Odin for inspiration. As a god of, he drank from the mead of poetry. And so, so that's where it comes from. But then there's also those who seek out magical knowledge. And those people, like the shamanistic sort, were kind of shunned by society and considered outsider to some degree. I mean, the role of shaman is to sit outside so that you're in between the realm of the dead and the people that you serve in life. And so that was another one of Odin's roles. And so there are people drawn to that. I think there's still people drawn to that aspect of things. And then the last one being the berserker, or more specifically, the Ulfindar, which were the wolf warriors. Ulf, U-L-F. Anytime you see that, it means wolf in Old North. Even names like Wolfred or Ulfred, U-L-F, Fred. It just means wolf friend or friend of the wolf. And so even in modern English, wolf hasn't actually changed all that much. We added the W, but originally it was just U-L-F, wolf. So W-O-L-F. Anyway, I love the way the little language stuff fits in.
Yeah.
So, you get, berserkers were in all of the writings about them in the actual folklore, in like the sagas and stuff like that. When a berserker character shows up, he's usually an asshole, and he usually has to be overcome in some way because the laws around berserkers were different. Like berserkers could basically get away with murder when a normal person couldn't. But in return, the berserker was someone who agreed to basically run first headlong, into battle and berserk, and be crazy. And there's some thoughts that berserkers certainly had some sort of ritual to psych themselves up for battle. But it may have involved either like some form of mushroom or some sort of chemical concoction that, like, if you imagine a 6.5 foot tall, half naked guy in a bear skin with a giant, sword shield or battle axe and, foaming at the mouth, doing drugs and just running into battle. I mean, we're talking about like that's definitely going to break the Olympics rules right there. Like,
all right. I remember reading something about, specifically it was like a mushroom, like ale concoction that they would drink, and supposedly, obviously, like put them on another plane, and that's what drove them to turn into bears and whatnot.
Sure, and we don't know for sure. The word berserker, it actually means bear-cirker. And bear means bear. I didn't change all that much. And cirker means shirt. And so it means bear shirt. Now, when Snorri starts writing about the berserkers, he has them bare-chested, like we think of like taking off your shirt and being bare-chested, right? But that really doesn't hold up when we start looking. And what modern scholars anyway think is that they wore like bear headdresses or bear furs to signify their thing. But another thing that's interesting with the berserker is bear was one of the names of Thor. In fact, I actually know a guy, he was in an art class with me named Torbjorn. His name means Thor bear. And that's a modern, like me and you got Kenny, I got that guy is named Thor bear, Torbjorn. Yep. He's a great artist. Really nice dude. He's from Scandinavia.
That'll do it.
Yeah, I know. Heritage. But what's interesting is Thor is commonly associated with the bear. There's lots of references there. So what were these berserkers actually of Odin? It's hard to know, but we do know that the Ulfindar, who were the wolf warriors, were definitely Odin's wolves. And there's a lot of modern resurgence and interest in the Ulfindar or Ulfindin. There's a few different ways to spell it and say it, but these wolf warriors were thought to be intense. But anyway, so to go all the way back, those are our three archetypes. We have the poet, we have the shaman, and then we have the berserker or the Ulfindar. And all of them involve frenzy. And so Odin's name, Wod, means frenzy. And so there's the frenzy of creation, there's the frenzy of the spirit world, and then there's the frenzy of battle. And so, all of those things connect through, but there's a really good saga if you want a great story about one of Odin's people, and that's the Egil saga, Egil. And Egil is Egil Skallagrim. I'm not going to say this right. Grimsonar. And Egil Skallagrim, he was a skald. And his story is actually super depressing because he basically invokes Odin, saying, Odin's eye, look to me. I want to be the greatest poet. And then all this terrible stuff happens. It's been a while since I've really dug in on Egil's, but I remember that his family's killed, in specific, his son is killed in a really gruesome way. And he writes this poem, and is considered one of the greatest skalds of all time. But a part of his poem, he writes that it was through all of the turmoil that allowed him to find the words that would resonate through time. And so how often is that true, that our darkest moments create our greatest works? I mean, that certainly happened for me with my oil paintings, where there's been some really hard things I've gone through. And I don't believe that you have to go through hard things to create great art. But I also believe that when you do go through hard things, it's one of the most unifying experiences that all humans have. And if you can invoke any of that in the written form or the painted form, then the connection you can make to another human is so strong. And that's the sort of thing we look for when we consume art, is we look to see those emotional human connections. And Odin granted that to Egil. He granted it in a way where 1,000 years later, we still hear his words and know his story. But that's what it means to follow Odin, is to invoke death, to invoke Wod, to invoke frenzy, and everything that comes with it. And so it's no small wonder that Thor was more popular.
All right.
Because Thor liked to drink, and he liked to, play with his kids, and he was probably a little too rough, but that's just that's a big part of it. There's also then a lot of things that get mixed up with you were referencing, I made a post today on Instagram about Thor being Donar being king in Germanic lore, but that actually goes back a really long time. The references to Donar are very early in Germany's history. But even earlier, there's pretty strong evidence to show that Tyr was king. And so what's even more interesting is that the word Tyr in Old Norse can mean God. There's even one of Odin's names that I believe it's I think it's Hetir, which means spear god, but I might be getting that wrong. And Tyr is just used for the word for God, yet he has this whole other story. And so there's aspects of Tyr's tale. Why is it that Tyr sacrifices his hand to the wolf Fenris, right, in the early part of the myth cycle, yet Fenris eats Odin at the end? And then there's this reference to the fact that Tyr will battle Garm, and he falls to Garm, who is the hound who guards hell. Yet in there's some people who talk about the fact that all the wolves in Norse mythology are ultimately Fenris. And so at some point, those myths diverged. And what likely happened with Tyr is that Tyr was the main god in early Old Norse culture. And at some point, Odin's cult becomes more popular. And so as Odin's story rises, he takes on aspects. And so at his earliest form, really, when you're talking about like more Woden, he's more death god. That aspect of him was always there. The one-eyed god of death, who is the wolves. The wolves are often connected to death in many cultures. I mean, even in Egyptian culture, right? The god of death has a dog head.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and there, I think there's a belief, an early Egyptian belief, where dogs would actually be allowed to eat the corpses as a way of sending them to the next life. And there's more about that in a book I recommend in the past, which is Odin, the One-Eyed God, and the Indo-European Mannerbunda, which that's a heck of a word. But the Mannerbunda were the wolf cults of young men. It was the young wolf warrior that we've talked about. I think in a previous episode, we talked a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so anyway, yeah, you get to, this book, which I posted a link for in previous episodes, and I'll certainly post another link here. I can actually throw it up in the chat real fast. It's in my list of top 10 Norse mythology books. And in that particular book, the historian who wrote it, she talks a lot about the death cults and how that aspect goes back, and how other parts of Odin, the more warrior things, another of them being like Tyr having some connection to the spear, and Odin having the connection to the spear. And so as Odin rises to prominence, he takes on the aspects and becomes this god of war and death and shamanism and all these, layered things. So anyway, yeah, but Mjolnir, being the symbol, was also used in hallowing, or to make holy. We talked about in the last episode how it was set in the bride's lap in order to sanctify a bride during her wedding ceremony. But there's also thoughts that, Thor's hammer was like waved over people for healing, and any sort of way. There's hallowing ceremonies where I know the hammer and a torch, the torch representing light and the hammer representing sanctity, would be carried around a property in order to hallow the thing. There's actually Icelandic property rights, when they first settled there, involved tending fires at the four corners of your land for a certain period of time, and then that land became yours. And there's reference to that in some of the Icelandic sagas about, coming there. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, wearing Thor's hammer does not necessarily mean you're dedicated specifically to Thor, as much as it is. It can mean many things. I mean, in modern times, it can simply represent heritage. It can represent spirituality and your faith. It can, you could just think Norse mythology is cool and have watched a lot of Vikings. It's like you see them all over. So
awesome. Okay, so there's something that you that answers that.
Yeah. Okay,
good. But there's something you said earlier about, and I may catch you off guard on this question, in which case I apologize. But you mentioned earlier something about knowing runic magic to get you out of like sticky situations, like calling upon Odin. Can you tell me more about that?
So Egil's saga, again, has a lot of references to the runic magic. In particular, Egil's glass is poisoned, and because of a certain ritual, he has to drink the mead he's been given, or he'll have breached hospitality. And so he manages to mark the goblet with a rune of warding, basically. and the glass explodes, and they have to bring him a new cup that's not poisoned, right? But the cup will only explode if there was something poisonous inside of it. So that's one example of a rune. But there's lots of references to runes of protection, to runes of putting a rune on your sword to bless the sword in battle, a lot of stuff like that. But when we start getting into runes, it's really hard to know what the ancient people were talking about, because rune refers to the literal written letter. It's like saying alphabet, right? So that's one reference to rune. Rune also just means magic. For example, I recently learned that necromancy or death magic in Norse culture was called Hellruna or Helleruna, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, definitely using that in some D&D games for sure. But you've got hell being the realm of the dead, and runa just referencing magic. And so you could also say they'd say like Save rune or Galdra rune, or it's just like saying sorcery. And so we don't know for sure if what we think of as the modern runes were specifically used as magical spells. We do know that they carved the Tyr rune into their blades, because we find those in grave sites, which is it looks like this. It's got it's like an arrow pointing up. It's the letter T, but Tyr also being a god of war, which then asks the question, why Tyr instead of say Odin or Thor, but that's how the runes are. And then there's what's called bind runes, which are when you take one or two or more runes and put them together in a way to create a symbol. So, for example, if you can imagine, like the rune for TH is Thurisaz. This is really hard to talk about runes without pictures, because it's a pictorial language. But and the Tyr rune. So Thurisaz is, I don't know which way it's showing through, but it's kind of like that. And so if you put an arrow on the top of that, you're combining or binding the runes together. Yeah, there you go. Hey,
there you go.
Yeah. Imagine that with an arrow on top, and you start to get to like, and so would that be binding you to war against your enemies, or would it be, that might be a really dangerous rune to do, actually. I certainly don't recommend people getting into buying runes uneducated, but that is what you're talking about. And so, but also you got to remember, like in fiction, which is what the sagas are, because there's lots of references to how Egil was a real person, and Egil wrote Egil's saga, very likely. We're not 100% sure on even that. But where it was poetry, right? So, certainly it was a good story. And so we have to remember that aspect. So the way magic is talked about in the sagas versus how it's talked about in modern heathenry versus what scholarship has on it, which if you there's a really good book on this stuff about the esoteric arts, and I don't think I've posted about it. Actually, I'm actually reading it now, but it's called the Northern European Esoteric Tradition, and so it's a dissertation, though. It's a historic work that examines grave sites of people that are either suspected sorcerers or are known sorcerers.
Wow.
Sorcerer is not necessarily the right term. Really, it'd be more like wise woman, which is called a Saith worker, or a Vala or a Volva. And examining what went into her burial and why was it there, how is it different than other burials from the same time period, and it gets really deep into all that stuff. But you've got there again, there's no way to know for sure. We talked about a little bit how one way thing that's done is to examine sermons from the conversion, and all the stuff it's saying not to do might be a good thing to try. But again. So the word rune is misleading when seen in context. And then there's also, we talked a little bit, I think, about Galder, which was magical poetry, and how it was repeated 3 times.
Oh yeah.
And how that for that reason they would not repeat runes one run right after another. And so which suggests that runic writing was a part of casting a spell, or why would they be superstitious about writing it? But again, it wasn't written down, and so there's no hard, clear. It's just going to be speculation.
Well, we know that, I mean, the Norse were nothing if not superstitious.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean,
right.
I'd say humanity in general.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Humanity in general. The rune question definitely is, kind of piques my interest, because we were reading went on drive yesterday and reading through the sagas, and there's a moment, I can't remember who it is. It may be Brunhild, where she talks about, she basically, and I think you and I have talked about this, though I don't think we've done it on the show, where we talk about the Norse equivalent of like the 10 Commandments. You know what I'm saying? And she kind of runs down a list that's like, don't believe a man who you've killed his brother or his son, and like that kind of thing. But then later on,
good advice, Brunhild. Good
yeah, totally. But later on, she talks about how or she starts talking a little bit about runes. She knows all this stuff about runes. She says carve this rune into your fingernail, carve this rune into your palm or into an eagle's beak and stuff like that.
Right. But does she say how to draw the rune?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. She just says she says she calls the rune by a name, but she doesn't say whatever. I think she says it by a name. I'll have to look at that again.
Right. And so and I mean there's a lot of stuff like that people assemble to try and put a modern sense to these things, for sure. But again, the sagas are not history, they're historic fiction.
Right.
And so it's also hard to know. But then the other thing is, Brunhild in that story is referencing runes in a way where you got to think about the audience would already know that. It'd be very simple for me to say, hey, pick up your phone, right? But if in 1,000 years no one knows what a phone is, then that line of dialogue in a story makes no sense. Yeah, okay. So Caitlin, your lovely wife, is in here, and she's saying she never says specifically just beach rune. I believe she means rune instead of ruin. But so specifically beech might reference birch, which
right.
There is the birch rune, which is Burkana, which is the letter B, and is thought to associate with Frigga. So it could be that specific. I don't know. I'd have to reread it again. I have not read a ton of the sagas, and I am much less. It's so much more to keep up with than just keeping up with the Norse lore. So
right, yeah. So back on the Norse lore, since I had my rune divergent.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
We had so what we've learned so far that why is Odin Odin is the All-Father, but he's not the common man god. People wear the Thor's hammer because to invoke Odin is maybe something that you don't want to do, or at least don't want to do until you've run out of options. A little dangerous.
On that line, we talked about the Volknut, the 3 interlocking triangles, and a lot of people get that as a tattoo. It is a super common tattoo. But I have heard that, kind of a joke in heathen community. I don't know if joke's quite the right word, but certainly jest is that symbol means insert spear here.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely how I used it in my painting of Balder,
right.
where I have the symbol. In fact, I'll pull that up. You keep summarizing.
Okay, yeah. So we learned that to invoke Odin is to perhaps invoke death, or at least hardship to get what you want. Like if you want to be like Egil and have your words known for 1,000 years, you can, but you're going to pay the price.
Yeah.
Which I think is like terrifying. Like that puts a whole new light on Odin, I think, that I had never really thought of before, but it totally makes sense.
I mean, that's basically Odin's calling card, though, right? Is like knowledge, but all knowledge has a price.
The sacrifice, yeah, his eye at the well, right?
Sure. The sacrifice, yeah, but I mean, really, price. It's that, and I mean, think of your own life. There's nothing we learn that doesn't come at a cost, even if the cost is simply time.
Yeah.
Right. There's only so much time. You can't learn everything, and so I mean, that's one really simple price. But there's certainly others, because as you learn, your worldview is forever changed. And I think a lot of that's good. Like, obviously, as a society, we've decided to educate our people to some degree, but it's not without a cost.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so we learned that, and that's why people wear Thor's hammer. He's a little more of a family man, a little more of the everyday Joe, I guess, or like maybe Thor's kind of like the archetype that we see in ourselves. Is that kind of
And also was, so Odin was the poet's god and the king, the noble's god. Thor was the farmer's god, right? There's a lot more farmers than kings and poets.
Yeah, you're right about that.
Even in modern life, if we extend that to the working person, there's a lot more workers than there are those who consider themselves king.
Well, good.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, and that's why that's why some people wear the Thor's hammer, the Mjolnir. Okay, I like that. And then, oh yeah, you were gonna bring something up?
Yeah, so I can share my screen real fast here. I was just gonna show. So this is the piece, Death of Balder, and you can see there, right there, is the 3 interlocking triangles with the runes. All of the runes are actually around his chest, and that's right where the spear has gone. And I did a whole video. If you're on this channel and you want to see that, I talk with Dr. Matthias Norvig, who is an expert in Scandinavian religious practices and pre-Christian influences. Fascinating guy. And me and him talked for over an hour about Balder and how Balder represents so many things. But one of the things he represents is the ultimate Odinic sacrifice and the archetype of the Odinic warrior that culminates. And he, of course, Balder is Odin's son. And I don't want to rehash all of that, but if that wets your whistle, go check out that video. It's over an hour. And I set the conversation to me actually painting the painting of Balder. I recorded myself. And so I put all of that stuff over the top of it. So anyway,
awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to watch that, because that's like that's the whole point.
and Matthias, I mean, you guys think I know about this stuff, but holy crap, Matthias is a legit professor over in Colorado Boulder, and he's from Denmark. He's a Dane he actually came to America as a part of the Danish government pays for Danish scholars to go and teach at other schools throughout the world. And so I found out, like, part of his salary is actually paid for by the Danish government to bring Scandinavian studies to the rest of the world, which, I mean, that's just a super cool thing, I think. But
yeah, that's amazing.
Anyway, but yeah, he is so deep in on this stuff and so knowledgeable, and actually speaks Old Norse. And of course, he speaks Danish and he speaks English. And so he does his own translations of the text, so he understands it on a level. And I'll tell you, man, kind of like this, where you're asking me a question and I talk for 10 minutes. That's what it was like for me with Matthias, is I'd get him going and then just sit back, and it's really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps my only other question, and with this maybe who knows? So I innocently ask a question, and then there's like a huge hill we have to climb up.
Yeah.
But so there's Frigg and then Frigga, right?
Okay, so that's easy to answer.
Okay, great.
Whenever the A is added, it's anglicized. So Frigg is actually much closer, Frigg, Frigg. or even earlier was Frige.
Frisch, yeah.
But Frigg, yeah, and then Frigga is just it's anglicizing the word, and so I mean you see that as well with Hel being Hela. Hel is the name of the goddess and the name of the place, and that gets super confusing. So modern people like to use Helheim to refer to death home, right? Heim means home, and Hela to be the woman's name, the goddess's name. But yeah, there is no distinction between Frigg and Frigga other than being English or not.
Okay, and then who was Frigg?
So Frigg is Odin's wife and the mother of Balder. She famously appears in the Death of Balder story as the one who asked all of the different beings of the world to not harm her beloved son. And of course, she forgets mistletoe, and that leads to his demise. And she weeps for Balder. She also weeps at the death of Odin as well at Ragnarok. And she's described in the Prose Edda, being the queen, as having all these handmaidens, the 12 handmaidens of Frigg. And it's very clear that there was more to the handmaidens. They kind of each get like a sentence, whereas the gods get paragraphs and pages and stories. But it's very likely that, or I wouldn't say likely, it's my personal belief and many others that the handmaidens were goddesses in their own right. And that, there's Gefn, who is the goddess of marriage, and Na, who rides a white horse with golden teeth, who delivers messages. She's the messenger of Frigg. And then there's Eir, E-I-R, who is the healer. And you just have to know that the goddess of healing played a very important role in day-to-day life, but we don't have the stories of Eir. And modern people are doing a lot to bring back an interest in to fill out stories with these goddesses, but there's not any clear older text. Most of the older texts are kind of a glossary of terms for the goddesses and a few stories about Frigg and about Freya. Those are our two main goddesses that get the most attention.
Right. I was just going to ask that. So there's like Frigg and Freya, and then that's kind of it, right? As far as aside from like the handmaidens.
There's Hela.
That's right. That's right.
There's not necessarily thought that people actually worshipped Hela in the way you would worship a goddess, but there's over 100 gods and goddesses in Norse mythology. I can't list them all for you here, but if you find a full directory of them, there's so many, particularly because the certain giants are gods and goddesses as well. Skadi being a great example, or Skadi, depending on how you say it. She's a wonderful goddess. She's a goddess of the hunt, a goddess of vengeance and feminine power. So as you can imagine, the notion of feminine vengeance is one that's very popular with a number of modern heathen lasses. And her story is so freaking cool because her, typical story, Thor kills a giant in a previous story. Turns out that giant was important. The daughter of that giant is Skadi, and she shows up and she's like, I want my weregild, which weregild is the price. Everyone had a price from peasant to king, right? And so she's like, I want the price for my father. And Odin, sets her this banquet. And basically it comes down to like part of the price is that she wants a husband, and she needs to be made to laugh. And the way Loki gets her to laugh is he ties a rope to his balls and ties the other end to a goat, and then has the goat ride around the room and carry him around by his nuts. There's actually a carving, an ancient carving that shows Loki being pulled by a goat by his groin, which is just fabulous. It's one of my favorite stories because it's just, you can't imagine it being a play right? Like, I mean, if you grew up Christian, you went to plays where they would do the various Bible stories, right? But that's common to all cultures, just to do these things as plays. So if you imagine a play and like the Loki character having his nuts tied up and just like prancing around the stage, I mean, it's so comical, even today, that when you read that story. And of course, the story ends with her she wants to marry Balder because he's so beautiful, but she ends up picking Njord because she can only see the god's feet, and Njord has the most beautiful white feet because he spends all his time on the beach, and so the sand makes his feet white. Anyway, that's a summary. Go read the story for yourself. It's way better than I just did it. But so that's another goddess, and yet Skadi is a giant, but famously she's the one who places the snake above Loki's head. And there's some thought, there's a line that her and Loki were close, and so it's commonly thought that there was a deeper relationship where Skadi and Loki were kind of hitting it on the side. And part of her being the goddess of vengeance is she's actually saying, look, not only did you betray all the gods, but you betrayed me. And so she's not down with that. And so, yeah. Anyway, so yes, there's so much more to the goddesses. I mean, there's also Loki's wife, Sigyn, who I think is a really interesting attribute, a part of Loki's story. She stands with the bowl above his head, even after everything that has been done, even after her children were taken from her because of Loki's actions. She continues to play the role of dutiful wife. And a lot of modern pagans hold her up as one who honors the oath that women make. There's lots of oaths that men make. And so surely there was more to Sigyn's story than just holding this bowl. And yet that's all we have left. And she's not listed among Frigga's handmaidens. So, and then there's, who is it? There's Freya, Frey. So Frey is Freya's brother, and he marries a giantess, Gerdur, who's the most beautiful woman in all the 9 realms. And he's so infatuated with her that he gives away his sword to be with her. And yet then she becomes a goddess of love as well. So the line between giant and god and giantess and goddess is very blurred.
They're kind of like, they're not too, like, I feel like when people think of, like, they hear like gods, where's my camera? Gods and giants. They're really more like cousins than like.
Yeah. And so what giant really meant was outsider. And basically you have the gods or Asgardians who were the tribe and the giants who were another tribe. And what they're showing, I think, is that when marriages happened across tribes, the outsider becomes a part of your tribe as you merge your families. Like they had some, I think we talked about adoption a little bit in a previous episode, but they were very big on the idea that if you were adopted or if you married into a family, you were a part of that family, no questions. Even that now that family's ancestors would look after you and your luck, that you are incorporating that and your luck is combined in the act of marriage, which, it is, I think everyone understands that if they've been married for any length of time, your luck is very much tied to that of the other person. And the ripples of your marriage affects your line for many years to come, even your own siblings and her siblings or your spouse's siblings, all that stuff. And so they just had different ways of speaking about it, but it really isn't all that different, than the way we think about it today.
Yeah, that's good to know. Okay. And then, so we touched that you said that there's like, hundreds of gods and goddesses in like the Germanic Nordic lore.
Yeah.
Is there a place that we can find a directory like that, or
just search for full list of Norse gods and you'll start getting into it. But also in some of those books I've recommended where they dig in, they're in there too. They get more full into the lists.
And that's just like, I mean, obviously, like we have like the big guys, Odin, Tyr, Freya, Frigg, all them. But like the others, are they just like kind of like local deities, like we had kind of talked about, or is it just kind of like?
No, it's just there's story like Bragi is a great example. Bragi is the god of poetry, and he's Odin's son. But one of Odin's older names was the Bragirful. So is Bragi Odin's son, or is he Odin in another form, or what's going on? But Bragi's married to Idun, and Idun is the one who has the apples of immortality that keep the gods young. And that's one thing about Norse mythology that's different, is the gods would actually age. They wouldn't necessarily die, but they'd age.
Right.
Well, the apples are what keeps them young and healthy and strong. And that's Idun, and she's married to Bragi, and that there's stories around the two of them very prominent. There's a line, I did a painting called Bragi's Tongue, because there's a line in the lore that says that Bragi has a rune carved tongue, which is a fancy way of saying he had a gifted way of speaking, or a silver tongue might be a similar way of talking about it. And that's another example of us talking about the runes, just saying that his voice was magic, right? He had a rune carved tongue. But I did a painting where
the one where he's like that, right?
Yep, that's the one. And he's literally pulling or playing his tongue, and runes are carved down his light tongue, and the runes spell out inspiration ultimately in that painting as well.
Good to know. I have that hanging right above my tattoo station.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, there you go. So that's Bragi, and Bragi is a full god, and there are some place names that refer to Bragi. So that's one of the big indicators of is a god or goddess, how worshipped were they? Are there hills named after them that have survived into this time? And that's very true. But you know who doesn't have any place names that we're not aware of? Loki. And so there's some people who say that means that Loki was a much later addition, and that may not have actually been worshipped as a god. And of course, other people get very upset about that and do not like that at all. And so I don't have a particular I don't have a horse in that race, so to speak. But there are other. But Loki, what we can't deny is that in the written form that we have of Norse mythology, Loki plays an incredibly important role. I mean, if you think the big three are kind of Loki, Thor, and Odin, right? Like almost all the stories involve them in some form. Yeah. Yet there's no place names. And then there's gods like Bragi who have place names, or even Balder has place names, but we don't know a lot about Balder other than that he dies. And so again, it's hard to know what's going on or what's there. And that's the thing I actually love about Norse mythology, is when you really dig in, you're opening up a puzzle that doesn't totally have answers. And so you have to begin to piece those things together for yourself. I also think it's why, or one of the reasons why, there's so much modern interpretations. Even the Marvel Comics Thor is because those guys loved those myths, and they wanted to answer those questions for themselves. And so they started to play around with those myths in the modern myth, which is the comic book.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to say, like, the American mythos, right, is our comic books.
Yeah. Oh,
and sure. Also Star Wars, like,
yeah.
But like, that's how, that when you think, like, part of this whole journey that I started, that you've been helping me on, is just feeling like I had no culture, right? Like, as like just like a white guy in America, what is my culture? I don't know.
Yeah.
But like knowing, like, the closest that I could come up with was like, as far as like our myths, the stories that we tell each other, it's all media. It's all this entertainment media, right, that we don't believe in what happened, that happened as a, we don't believe that apocalypse came and the X-Men defeated him.
Right.
But we can all sit around and talk about the cool parts of the stories, and we can lament the characters that died, and we can be excited when they come back. And it's all of this like cyclical like myth telling that is comic books and media in America.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyways, that's my tangent, I suppose.
Good. Well, man, we've been talking about 50 minutes, so
Right.
we're coming up on about an hour here. So, man, again, thanks so much for the questions. Like, I love it. Good conversation. I've enjoyed myself, so thank you.
Me too. Thank you for holding most of the conversation and for enjoying my questions. And shout out to my internet for not being terrible today.
You got good internet now, so that's great.
Yeah.
Everybody who showed up and watched us live, really appreciate it.
Totally.
We're going to do this again. We're thinking about maybe doing it every couple of weeks in the evenings. So hopefully more people can find out about it and join it. If you do like it, we'd love it if you just click the like button down below, ring that bell, all the YouTube stuff. But more than anything, since this is a new thing, if you just share it with someone else that you think would also dig these conversations that Kenny and I are having, it would really help a lot.
Totally.
I'm Sam Flegal. If you want to see more of my stuff, I've posted some links in the chat, and I'll post them down below. But if you go to fatefulsigns.com, you can find pretty much everything you're into. And you can follow Kenny on Instagram. That link's also down below if you want to see what this dude's been up to. So anyway. All right. Later.
Later, guys.